Welcome back, everyone. Last week, you had a survey article about the ethics of mood-enhancing drugs, a sort of rough overview of the literature and how the moral debate has evolved over the last, 30, 40 years. This time around, you got an article that focuses on just one dimension of that debate. It's Catherine McKinsey and Mary Walker's essay on basically how mood-enhancing drugs can potentially affect a person's personal identity and whether or not that would be morally objectionable. So I thought that given that these articles overlap, the best way to handle it would be to try to synthesize both articles into one cohesive lecture instead of treating them each as standalones. So let's go ahead and get into it. First, timeline, just to kind of give you a little bit of background and put this in a visually digestible format. In the 1950s and 60s, the first antidepressants were developed. Building on that research, in the 1970s, you've got the development of SSRIs. That's a common abbreviation for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Those drugs basically work to improve a person's mood by increasing the levels of serotonin in the brain. Serotonin is a hormone that just kind of makes people feel good, so to speak. And Prozac was one of these SSRIs and became the most popular and probably the most well-known. Now, Prozac didn't become available until 1987, and when it was first being put on the market, it was a very controversial drug. There were a lot of concerns about the effects that it might have in people who took it. One of the biggest defenders of Prozac was Peter Kramer. In 1993, Kramer published a book called Listening to Prozac, which was a huge, defense of the use of Prozac in clinical settings. Most of what he did to defend the use of Prozac was to draw on his own experiences in a clinical setting where he had given Prozac to patients and simply recorded their experiences. And the gloss that he puts on the use of Prozac is extremely positive in that book. And I posted on Carmen an interview with him, a very recent interview, where, roughly 25 years after this book's publication, he's kind of reflecting back on it and looking at the state of mental illness in the United States and talking about his own outlook. And his view on Prozac really hasn't changed all that much. It hasn't... the reason I point that out is because in the 90s, you saw sales of SSRIs, including Prozac, spike dramatically. And as their use became more widespread and more research was done on them, we started to get a much better understanding of some of the negative effects that are associated with the use of Prozac. And what I thought was kind of fascinating is that even though those negative effects have become better known, that information has not really dampened Kramer's enthusiasm for Prozac or his support of it as a drug. So his take seems to be that given how debilitating depression is, he still thinks that Prozac is one of the very best treatment options for it, even though we now know more things about ways in which it's not as effective as we originally thought maybe 30 years ago, and some of the additional side effects it can have. So that's kind of how some of this played out in the real world. Now let's look at some of the other ways. So this is all about basically SSRIs, mood-enhancing drugs. It's worth noting, and this comes up in the Shermer article, there are other ways that you can try to enhance a person's mood by directly manipulating the brain. These are four of them that come up. They're all a little bit different. They involve the stimulation of different parts of the brain. You've got deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, vagal nerve stimulation, and direct current transcranial stimulation. I'm not going to run through every single one of these and explain all of the subtle differences between them. The core idea is that each of these procedures involves administering an electrical current directly to a person's central nervous system, usually a part of the brain or a nerve that's connected to the brain, to try to alter the way a person feels in some way or another. For the most part, a lot of the discussion about mood enhancement has not really focused on these particular technologies. It's mostly been about drugs, but it's worth acknowledging that this stuff, if it were to become more widespread, we'd see some of the same kinds of debates and concerns about these technologies that we see around Prozac and other mood-enhancing drugs. So, what are some of the main reasons to favor the use of mood-enhancing drugs, or just mood enhancement more generally? Well, the most obvious one is that these drugs and procedures can serve as treatment for depression or similarly debilitating mental illnesses. So, given that a lot of people who have severe depression or severe anxiety or perhaps other conditions that are just unpleasant to them, given that in extreme cases these conditions drastically reduce a person's quality of life and their ability to just perform basic functions, alleviating those conditions massively increases their personal autonomy. And generally, other things equal, promoting autonomy is a good thing. Giving people the means to make their own decisions, be independent, live their own lives, etc. Is a good thing. It's also just worth noting that even for people whose conditions aren't that severe, improving their mood can increase their welfare. And we had some people mention that point in discussion last week, where they said, look, even if I don't have any condition for it, I mean, why wouldn't you want to? If you could take a pill that would basically just make you feel a little better, why wouldn't you take it? That sort of thing. So you've got a reason in favor of promoting people's autonomy, and you've got a reason in favor of just improving people's well-being. Also worth acknowledging that the use of mood-enhancing drugs might enable certain people who suffer from emotional deficits, say, to experience emotional highs, feelings of euphoria, etc., that they otherwise just can't experience. It might be their only way to have those kinds of positive emotional states. Now, on the other side, why would you want to oppose mood enhancement? And I would stress, these benefits are pretty straightforward and seem fairly strong. They seem to carry some significant moral weight. So, what's on the other side? Well, one concern is that the happiness experienced through mood enhancement wouldn't be as valuable as genuine happiness. Again, this is something that came up during our class discussion last week. The classic example of this, which is in the Shermer article, is mood enhancing drugs could be looked at in the same way as Soma is looked at in the Aldous Huxley novel Brave New World. So Soma in Brave New World is a very extreme mood enhancing drug that makes people feel extraordinarily content, but it also more or less turns them into like happiness zombies. They just sort of lose all sense of concern or care about the world around them. And the government actually uses Soma to basically keep the population of the society in check. So the society in Brave New World is a sort of dystopian authoritarian regime that uses with extreme surveillance that does everything it can to keep the citizens in line and just keep them obeying Big Brother without a whole lot of second thought. And Soma plays a role in that. It's a tool that the government uses to keep people content, even though the society in which they live in is one where they don't have a lot of intellectual freedom, or really any freedom at all. So the takeaway here, the comparison, is supposed to be, if mood-enhancing drugs just make you feel good, but without any real connection to actual lived experience, there's a worry that it's going to be analogous to that state that's induced by using Soma in Brave New World. And that kind of happiness doesn't seem like the sort of happiness we really want, or a kind of happiness that's very valuable. Now, another concern about mood enhancement, which originates from Carl Elliott, is that using drugs to alleviate discontent doesn't really solve the underlying problem associated with that discontent. So Carl Elliott thinks that the main source of people being depressed or otherwise dissatisfied with their life originates from some sort of emptiness or alienation from the world. he thinks that those kinds of problems are existential in nature. They're philosophical problems that can only be resolved through rational deliberation. That if you start taking drugs to just improve your mood without addressing those underlying problems, then you're not actually treating the problem. You're just kind of masking it, right? The equivalent of sweeping it under the rug rather than actually cleaning it up. And he doesn't think that's an appropriate way to address this sort of problem, particularly because it could breed a sort of dependence on those drugs to keep those feelings of emptiness and alienation in check. Now, another objection to mood enhancement that comes up in more of a clinical setting is that a lot of people, and this was a common objection that was raised against Prozac back in the 1980s when it was starting to be proposed, a lot of people want to say that there is a meaningful difference between alterations in a person's mood that result from rational reflection and engagement and confronting the relevant issues, etc., which is typically what's done in traditional psychotherapy, versus things that happen via direct manipulation of a person's brain or nervous system. So, in other words, going to therapy and meeting with a counselor and talking through your issues and trying to come to a better understanding of how to resolve them, a mood change that eventually results from that kind of work is different and better, more valuable than the kind of mood change that results from just taking a drug and getting more serotonin in your brain. Now, Kramer's response to this is pretty straightforward. It's kind of interesting. His basic view of therapy is almost entirely instrumental in nature. His measure of whether or not a therapy works is how effective it is. So his view is, well, look, if you've got a person who psychotherapy works for them, that's great. If you've got a person that psychotherapy doesn't work and they can take Prozac and feel better, then that's great, and that's what they should do. So his view is that because Prozac is effective in treating a lot of patients that are otherwise basically untreatable, that's still good. That's still, valuable in what should be done. So, in other words, this is a long-winded way of saying Kramer doesn't buy this initial claim that there's a meaningful difference between these types of mood changes. His view is whatever you can do to induce the relevant mood change to get you out of depression, that's a good thing, and that's what you should do, whatever works. And the last one, which again, this also comes up in the Sherm article, although I don't think that this one came up at all in our class discussion, so it's a little different than some of these other ones. A concern in the medical profession specifically is that using mood enhancers contributes to the phenomenon of over-medicalizing conditions that we shouldn't regard as pathological. So one example that Shermer uses to illustrate the phenomenon is that it used to be in the past that people who were less outspoken, less inclined to participate in social settings and stuff, we would say those people were shy, and that wasn't viewed as a bad thing. That was just a character trait. It wasn't viewed as something that was dysfunctional or otherwise requiring any kind of clinical treatment. But now, of course, we recognize that there are certain kinds of social anxiety disorders. And one of the concerns about diagnosing people with those kinds of disorders is that you're now just labeling people who had what was, at a time in the past, an acceptable character trait, shyness. Some of those people are now considered to have a pathological condition that requires treatment. And the worry here is if you allow for the widespread use of mood-enhancing drugs to correct people's, dispositions, so to speak, their innate, personality with respect to how happy or sad, optimistic or pessimistic, whatever that they are, then the worry is that it increases the risk that we're going to start considering certain kinds of personality traits to be pathological when they aren't. So we can imagine an extreme case thinking like, oh, well, you have a pessimistic mood disorder. we're going to put you on Prozac for that. Well, being a pessimist has not typically been thought of as being a disorder, right? It might be a characterization of a person's outlook or worldview, but that doesn't. Plenty of people who are pessimistic it does not in any way impede their functioning or undermine their personal autonomy or anything like that. So if we actually considered that a mood disorder, that would seem to be an overreach, right? A case of over-medicalization, where we have now designated a personality trait as somehow an undesirable or pathological condition that needs to be treated with medication. And so the worry is that, mood-enhancing drugs like Prozac contribute to this sort of phenomenon. Okay. So that covers a lot of the I guess wider scope arguments and stuff that Schirmer in particular mentions in her survey article. Now we can dig a little bit deeper into one of the main concerns about mood-enhancing drugs, which is this connection between taking mood-enhancing drugs and affecting a person's personal identity. Now, I will say, because I have the article on my desk here, this article by Mackenzie and Walker, it's a dense article. It's definitely the toughest article in this unit that we've read. Not just because it's the longest, but also because there's a lot of terminology and there's a lot of abstract conceptualization. So if you didn't pin down everything that's in this article in the first read, that's okay. I think that's not surprising. Hopefully, what I say here will help to anchor some of the main ideas as you engage with it further. So here's the core argument. The concern about mood enhancement is that mood-enhancing drugs alter a person's fundamental psychology. And in doing so, they have the potential to alter a person's identity. The way that this has often been cashed out as a problem is in terms of authenticity. The self that is generated by mood-enhancing drugs is considered to be, in some way or another, inauthentic. It is not a reflection of a person's real self, right? It's like a doppelganger or something, like a mood-based doppelganger or a replica or something like that. But it's not the real thing. It's not the genuine article. And it stands to, I should add here, that the inference is that an inauthentic self is undesirable. So there's an assumption in the background of this argument that we want, as people, to be authentic, to be true to ourselves, to have, for the self that we project to the world, to accurately reflect who we really are as people. And so, being happy, if it's a result of this sort of inauthentic process of mood enhancement, seems to be a compromise that would be undesirable, right? The better option would be to be happy because it's an authentic reflection of who you really are. So the thought goes anyway. Now, when we talk about identity, there are basically three views of identity that the authors discuss in this article. One of the most common ones is numerical identity. This is probably the one that has the most robust philosophical literature surrounding it. A lot of ink has been spilled trying to pin down exactly what constitutes numerical identity. So numerical identity just refers to the properties that a person has that make them continue to exist over time. So historically, there's been two opposing views that have dominated this discussion. One of them is that numerical identity is about psychological continuity. It's about having the same mental states, the same memories, the same continued experiences in the mind over some long period of time. The opposing view, the competing view, is that numerical identity is all about biology. It's all about being a part of the same biological organism. So you can imagine how these two conceptions can come apart, right? Imagine that we get to a futuristic society where it's possible to do a brain transplant, and you can take your brain and put it into someone else's body, retaining your psychological continuity, but now you are not the same biological organism. Is that still you? Right? If you have your brain implanted into someone else's body, is that still you? The convert on the psychological continuity view, assuming that psychological continuity is maintained, it is still you. On the biological organism view, it definitely isn't. On the other hand, imagine if you suffer a severe head injury midway through your life, say when you're 40, and you suffer extreme amnesia, and you have no recollection of who you were, what you were doing, what your career path was, etc. You can't even remember your friends or family. So your psychological continuity is completely shattered. You now have, basically you had 39 to 40, we'll say 40 years of psychological continuity before this injury, and now you are starting a brand new thread, right, of psychological continuity, but it's completely independent and cut off from what happened in the past. In that situation, you're still in the same body. So on the biological view, you're still the same person. But on the psychological continuity account, you're not the same person anymore because your psychological continuity has been disrupted. So these two positions are incompatible with one another, and they're kind of opposing. Now, what's interesting for our purposes in the article is McKinsey and Walker basically say, whichever view you happen to take on numerical identity, mood enhancement would not meaningfully affect your identity on this conception, because mood enhancement does not disrupt psychological continuity. It doesn't affect your memories or past experiences or the connection between present and future present, past, and future experiences. Doesn't do anything that way, and it doesn't cause you to be a different biological organism. So on these two, in either of these accounts, mood enhancement doesn't pose a serious threat. Now, practical identity is the weird one on this list. This one I think is the hardest one to wrap your head around. Practical identity has to do with how you form a self-conception, by which I mean an understanding of your own first personal perspective. So it's somewhat subjective. Practical identity is somewhat subjective. It's about how you perceive yourself given what you value, how you choose to spend your time, who you associate with, what your aspirations are, etc. And because of that, it's a more personal way of understanding what the self is. And that may sound kind of abstract, and you may not have thought of it that way, but all of us have a certain way of perceiving ourselves, right? We have a conception of who we think we are, who we want to be, etc. Your practical identity is sort of like it's a label for how that manifests. The problem that the authors have with this view of identity is that, at least Christine Korsgaard's account of it, which is the main one they engage with, is that they don't think that practical identities do a very good job of understanding change over time for people. And all of these different views of self, whichever one you pick, they all have to be compatible with the ability to change over time, because none of us stays exactly the same from birth to death. We undergo, our values change, our priorities change. As a result of that, any account of personal identity needs to be robust enough to account for how these changes take place, and how we retain our sense of self and our ability to be the same person over time, even though we're different. When we're 25 as opposed to 15, and 35 as opposed to 25, and so on. And then the last one, which is the author's favorite conception, is narrative identity, which is, they describe it as how we define ourselves through self-narratives. I'm going to unpack that more on a subsequent slide, because it also has a significant social component. The authors don't think that our self-narratives are just isolated accounts of our own, that they're reflective in some way about against our background social relations. Now, so that's kind of understanding, unpacking a little more about identity. Now we got to unpack a little bit more about authenticity, because this is the other big, term or concept that's playing a role in this argument. There's an ambiguity in the concept of authenticity that looms really large in this literature. And it could be put this way. Does the concept of authenticity refer to a process of self-discovery, where the self is largely innate or fixed? So in other words, is your authentic self a sort of static entity that kind of exists within you in some form or another, and that you discover as you go through your life? Or is it a process of self-creation? So is it a process where you rationally reflect on the kind of person you want to be, and then you take actions and you make decisions to try to manifest that self through your actions? Is that the more accurate point of view? And depending on what view of authenticity you have, of what it means, what the authentic self is, that affects whether or not you think mood-enhancing drugs are a serious threat to personal identity. So here's Carl Elliott's view on this. He is a proponent, going back to this previous slide, he's a proponent of the self-discovery view. So for Elliott, if our real selves are fairly static, then the radical changes brought on by mood enhancement do suffice to change our identities, right? So if your real self is a sort of static entity that exists within you, and you take a mood-enhancing drug which radically alters your personality, you're now gravitating away from your true self, right? So now your newfound self appears to be inauthentic on this account. The opposing view is represented, it's not just David DeGrazia, but he's the most well-known proponent of this position. DeGrazia is an advocate of the self-creation view. So he thinks that we create ourselves through our choices. And if we autonomously create ourselves through our choices, the mood enhancement doesn't alter who we are, because the choice to take a mood-enhancing drug is simply a reflection of who we want to be and how we want to conceive ourselves. So depending on which view of the self you take, mood enhancement either isn't a threat to identity on the self-creation view, or it is a threat to identity on the self-discovery view. So then the question is, which of these conceptions of authenticity is most accurate? Because that seems like it's going to play a pretty big role on whether or not mood-enhancing drugs threaten our personal identities, right? What's interesting is that Mackenzie and Walker think that both conceptions of authenticity are inaccurate. Neither of them do a great job of really capturing the sense of self in an accurate way. So Mackenzie and Walker favor a narrative view of identity that involves relational components, by which I mean focuses on relationships with other people. So they think that there are aspects of our personal selves that are static, and those things tend to be fixed in some way by our relations with other people. So here are some things that you can't really change about who you are as a person. You can't change who your biological parents are. You can't change where you grew up, right? That's pretty much outside of your control. You can't change who was in your neighborhood or who you associated with when you were really young. The reason, you obviously have a limited amount of control, right? I'm not saying that when you were on the playground, you literally had no choice as to who you hung out with when you were, in elementary school. But the people that you're likely to be around, a lot of that is going to be determined by background forces that you're not going to be privy to or able to change when you're like 10 years old. So things about your familial relations, your background, the community you grew up in, your socioeconomic situation, your race, your biological sex, a variety of those kinds of things are essentially fixed. They cannot be changed. And so the relations that you form with other people, anchored to those things you can't change, that stuff's just kind of set. There's not really a lot you can do to change that. But you do have the ability to alter how your life goes within the context of those background relations with other people and with your community more broadly and so on. And so their view is that the narrative conception of identity can kind of capture both the fixed elements of identity, the things that can't be changed, and the things that we can change over time, the things that we do have control over. That's why it's their preferred conception. Now, because of their, because this view is kind of a hybrid account, right? It has a fixed component and it has a malleable component, an alterable component. Because of that, their take on how neurointervention affects identity is context sensitive. It depends on the specific intervention. So, if the neurointervention disrupts a person's autonomy so that they no longer can engage in what they call narrative self-revision, that refers to us changing our self-narratives in the context of background relations. So this would be like, choosing to embark on a different career path than you were originally planning on, say, or choosing to take up a political cause that you haven't before, something like that. Those would be examples of narrative self-revision, right? We're changing through our actions, we're making changes that reflect some kind of change in our personal values or in our way that we want to be perceived by others. So if the intervention prevents us from doing that in some way, then it hinders the development of our identity. But if the neurointervention alleviates psychological impairments, it actually might make narrative self-revision easier and thus aid the development of a person's identity. So if you're someone who's suffering from a severe neurological condition that is preventing you from exercising your autonomy and making lifestyle changes and choices that you want to make as a process of narrative self-revision, then alleviating those impairments will improve your ability to realize your personal identity. So it's going to depend a little bit on the case. It's going to depend in part on what the mood enhancement is being used for and what its effects are. But it's not, on their view, it's not going to be an all or nothing proposition, right? So unlike Eliot, it's not always going to be the case that taking mood enhancing drugs reflects, the creation of an inauthentic self. And unlike DeGrassia's view, it's not going to be the case, in opposition to DeGrassia's view, the authors don't think that mood enhancement is always going to be consistent with respecting a person's personal identity. There will be cases where mood enhancement hinders the development of personal identity. So it's a context sensitive approach, and that makes it a little more nuanced than the two approaches that they're engaging with. And this last slide, in case you want kind of a breakdown of where these authors stand, Carl Eliot, believer in the fixed inner self that we discover as we live our lives. He thinks that neurointervention violates a person's authenticity, and so he opposes neurointervention even when it's done voluntarily. So, background thing here that should be noted, all of these authors would object to neurointervention that is done involuntarily. So if a scientist or the government or whoever were to force you to take a mood enhancing drug, all of them would condemn that as unethical because it violates your personal autonomy. But Eliot's view is notable because he opposes neurointervention even when it is done voluntarily. On the opposite end of the spectrum, David DeGrassia, he thinks that we have a dynamic inner self, so it's not static, it's not fixed. We create over time through our actions. He thinks voluntary neurointervention upholds a person's authenticity because, being voluntary, it is a reflection of our personal choices. It is a reflection of how we want ourselves to be created. And he thinks that neurointervention is morally permissible unless it's imposed on someone against their will. So as long as it's voluntary, neurointervention is morally permissible. And then the sort of hybrid view that McKinsey and Walker are advocating, they view personal identity as being a result of this kind of relational narrative identity. And they think it depends as to whether or not neurointervention helps or hinders the development of someone's personal identity, and that we have to evaluate the permissibility of neurointerventions on a case-by-case basis. So that's where these three authors stand in relation to one another. Now, there is a lot more that you can dig into on the details of some of these different views based on what's in the article. I mean, like I said, it's a dense article. I've tried to give you the main highlights here so that you can make better sense of this stuff as you go through it. The key, though, if you take nothing else away from this article, just bear in mind, one of the biggest concerns about mood-enhancing drugs is, do mood-enhancing drugs in some way or another objectionably affect our personal identities? For Eliot, the answer is yes. For DeGracia, the answer is no. For McKinsey and Walker, the answer is sometimes. It depends on the context, right? That's their view. And so having an answer to that question is important in assessing the ethics of mood enhancement more generally, because it is part and parcel of using mood enhancement that it is going to alter your personality in some way. It is going to alter your dispositions. And so we've got to think about how the altering of those dispositions affects how we understand ourselves as people, and whether or not there's something objectionable about that. It's a complicated issue. But hopefully what I've given you here gives you a few more resources to think about it. That's all for now. I'll see you next time.